Well, hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Thank you all so much for tuning in. As you can tell, I've referenced my hair a few times during these last several videos, and I just got out of the shower now, but once this dries off, you're going to see a ton of hair frizzle up. Might actually happen during the duration of this video, so stay tuned. But the reason why I mention that is as a reminder, once we do hit 1,000 subscribers on this channel, I will be buzzing my hair off, and it will be donated to St. Baldrick's. That is a charity organization that donates hair to those who are suffering from pediatric cancer. It's a really, really great cause. I want to hit 1,000 subscribers. I mentioned by the end of October, hopefully by the end of this year, that we can get to that number. So be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and like the video. Be sure to comment any questions that you have regarding any of the content we talk about today. Okay, all programming notes aside, here is what is on the docket. We mentioned yesterday during our video that we were going to be covering more of the severe weather potential out towards the plains and the Midwest as we go into this week. Yesterday's video, we talked about the severe weather potential for both the Texas and Oklahoma Panhandle. So if you want some information on that, you can take a look at that breakdown video yesterday. Of course, be sure to look at the Storm Prediction Center in your local National Weather Service for the latest information. But today we're actually going to call an audible. We're going to talk about the tropics today. We've done that over our last several videos. We took a break yesterday, but we're going to circle back to that because we have two areas of potential development. The first one being well off the coast of the Sahara in Africa. That has a very high chance of development into a tropical system over the next 7 days. Also, we have a secondary area off the coast of Florida and the Carolinas. This circle that I outlined here also has a pretty decent chance of development or tropical development over the next several days. That in of itself is a lot closer to home, and we really need to pay close attention to this because, unlike our last systems that formed off Africa and took several days to move through the Atlantic and curve upwards and make any sort of impact, this band of convection is unique in that it's very close to home. So we're going to break all that down during today's video, show some of the models that are hinting at this, show why we are potentially seeing some tropical development this close to shore, and just give you the full breakdown. So as I mentioned, be sure to like, subscribe, share the video with family and friends. And with that being said, let's get into today's tropical weather video. Alright guys, just like I advertised at the top of the video, and as I suspected, my hair has officially frizzled out and become a bird's nest. So, I know I'm advertised as a forecaster, and I think I got that right. So, just wanted to give you a heads up in case you were keeping track. As you notice, I certainly was right about that. But anyway, let's begin first by taking a look at our water vapor imagery map. And as you can see, just a couple of features to point out here. You do have a cold front that continues to move off of the Atlantic shoreline and moving eastward. You see these little bubbles of clouds? Well, this is actually some convection that's forming along that frontal boundary. So that dry air, just like we talked about over the last few videos, whenever you see this upper level water vapor imagery and you see sort of a dry component, that's usually indicating some sort of front. Not always, but sometimes. In this case, we can really denote that just based on the arcing motion that this is a cold frontal boundary that's moving through. To the east of that, we have Hurricane Nigel, a pretty wide and broad eye with this system. That's going to continue to increase its northern latitude, and as you might suspect, there is some dry air intrusion. Not necessarily intruding into the system, I should actually correct that. It's more so displaced to the north, but this hurricane is moving into the trajectory of that dry air. So it's going to be interesting to see if any of that is encountering the hurricane. What you notice though is this dry plume just to the west of Hurricane Nigel. That may act as an inhibitor to its strengthening. Not just the fact that it's moving into colder waters, but the fact that it's going to be encountering some of that dry air to the west. So we'll have to watch that space. Again, Hurricane Nigel is expected to weaken and remain well offshore of the lower 48 and eventually move off to sea. That being said, way down the road for our friends in the United Kingdom, this could still pose a weather threat to you guys, maybe not in the form of a hurricane, but potentially a tropical system as it gets ever so close to the United Kingdom and Western Europe. So we'll have to keep a close eye on Nigel still. At least for the lower 48, it's not expected to impact those folks, but as we get closer into Western Europe, by the time we move into next week, this system still could be a tropical storm. Now, we do also have one last area to note, and this is our ongoing conveyor belt of convection across the eastern Atlantic off the coast of the Saharas. We do have this pretty nice plume that fired off here just off the coast of Africa, right over land that is moving into the Atlantic. We're going to have to keep a close eye on that. That could pose some development way down the road. It's not an immediate threat right now. Our main area of concern, at least denoted by the National Hurricane Center, is this broad banding of convection. It's in a very favorable environment for development going forward. You can tell a lot of this dry air is way off to the west. We have a pretty nice moisture plume. There is some dry air just to the south, north of Venezuela. But that's not really impacting a lot of the convective development here. So we're going to have to keep a close eye on this particular area, as well as the western coast of Africa moving forward in these next 7 to 14 days. In addition to that, though, I wanted to show you guys just the infrared satellite perspective of this. You can really note the deeper convection on this particular product. Once again, here is Hurricane Nigel continuing to move northward in latitude. Our really broad band of convection out here in the south central Atlantic. And then as you go to the western coast of Africa, you can see some pretty deep convection denoted on our infrared map. By the way, how we're able to denote where our deep convection is happening is based on our color table. Let me go ahead and actually move this pen feature over to the western part of the page. And this is really taking a scope at the cloud top temperatures. So the colder the cloud tops, the deeper the convection. If they're towering really, really high, that means that our cloud tops are going to be colder because that air parcel is very buoyant up until a very high point in the troposphere. So what this is saying is the deepest convection and the most organized convection is still off in the western Africa coastline, and that's going to continue to move westward over time. And like I said before, that's going to continue to pose a potential threat of development over the next 7 to 14 days. The other area that we mentioned at the top of our conversation is the convection along this broad cold front that continues to move off of the Atlantic coastline like we talked about. This convection is not really posed as a threat to anybody, and this is just going to stay well offshore. But as we're going to talk about here, this area of the Carolinas and the Atlantic coastline of Florida is going to have to seriously be watched for the potential for some close tropical development. As I talked about here in the very beginning of this video, keep in mind our center of attention has really been off the Africa coast for any tropical development. We did have a dahlia that formed out here in the Gulf, Yucatan, and Caribbean, but that right now has been pretty much closed off from what we remember the last few weeks. But we haven't seen a lot of development in this corridor. So that's going to be a first for this year. It's not something that happens all the time in the tropics, but this is going to be one of those rare instances where we might actually see a tropical system develop a lot more closer to home as opposed to waiting for it 7 to 14 days out. Now, we're going to begin first by just kind of setting the scene here and looking at what our current conditions are. I've referenced this map quite a few times. It's courtesy of the University of Miami. This is looking at our sea surface temperatures. One thing that I want to highlight that I think is really cool. Take a look at Maine, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. You remember that our cooler temperatures for Hurricane Lee were actually along the coastlines of the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy. Gulf of Maine, not May, sorry. The Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy. Well, notice that our temperatures, the sea surface temperatures, have actually decreased along this area. And the reason why is because, remember, our hurricanes, that's a lot of energy that's being fed into the system. Those sea surface temperatures are a catalyst to tropical development, or one of the many catalysts for tropical development. And when those systems move through, sometimes what you can see is a temporary sharp decrease in your sea surface temperatures in any of the regions that system affected. You can even see that plume left over from Hurricane Lee right over the central Atlantic, or the west central Atlantic. You notice, though, that where Hurricane Lee was in the beginning, when it was a major just off the Windward Islands, or the Leeward Islands, that's recovered quite considerably. But a lot of these areas haven't yet. So expect to see our sea surface temperatures recover out here in the west central Atlantic. Eventually, a little bit of a warm-up towards May. I keep saying Maine, or May. Maine, the Bay of Fundy, and the Gulf of Maine. Expect those sea surface temperatures to recover as well. But they will still be cooler, because remember, as we increase latitude with any of our systems, our sea surface temperatures do decrease. They're warmest closer to the equator and to the Tropic of Cancer, and cooler as we get closer to the poles. So we're not going to see like a sharp warm-up in the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy and any of those areas of New England. But instead, we may see those temperatures kind of creep back up to where they were normally for this time of year. Now, this is our current wind shear map. And remember, I showed this about a few videos ago, and I think it's a really useful product. And what this does is it not only shows you your wind shear vectors, highlighted here kind of in this maroon color, but it also gives you the bulk wind shear change over this period, at least as of right now. This is 12 UTC on September the 19th, so this is as of this morning, okay? And as you can see, if we look away from the Leeward Islands and back towards where our convection is, we do have a bit of a shear increase in these areas, and this would be denoted as unfavorable. But look downstream of where our Gulf system is, and I shouldn't say Gulf, I apologize, our convective initiation is. I have a lot of tongue twisters today, guys, so I apologize. There's a lot of bloopers in this video. I'm so sorry. So we have a lot of shear off the coast of the Sahara, right? About a 25 to 30 knot increase. But downstream of that, you have a little bit more favorable conditions. So we are certainly expecting any of the development that fires in this corridor, as that continues to move westward, we should expect to see some more tropical development out of those bands. The reason why there's not any notation for that big bundle of convection that's moving off Sahara right now is because it's going to be encountering a lot of wind shear. So although I do expect this to potentially still develop within the next 7 to 14 days, that deep convection we saw off the African coast, the problem is it's got a lot of wind shear to work with, so that's where our uncertainty comes in. So we'll have to just continue to monitor the situation and see if anything comes of that. But in the immediate term, this just band of broad convection is really going to be our center of focus going forward because it's moving into a favorable environment over that period. In addition to that, just off the coast of Florida and the Carolinas, our secondary focus area, or area of concern, a ton of wind shear. And this makes sense, right? Because we have a cold front moving through, and cold fronts bring a lot of bulk shear with them, especially ones that have a really nice steepness to them. So we understandably have seen a sharp increase of our wind shear. So obviously anything behind the front, we're not going to be seeing a lot of development in this region. However, that's going to change as we start to see a shift in our jet stream pattern back towards the lower 48. I want to begin first by just highlighting, though, where we're expected to see some of our development. I've mentioned this a couple times already during the video, but our area of concern over the next 7 days, the highest chance is going to be associated with that band and that broad area of convection just off the coast of the Sahara. We are expecting anywhere between a 60 to 70% chance of tropical development during that span. Now, the second area we have here is a 30% chance of development over the next 7 days, and that's going to be just off the coast of the Carolinas, getting back towards Georgia and Florida. That area is going to be a little bit more interesting. And the reason why is because this is so close to home. I think if we were doing a name game, or how many times I've said a certain phrase during this video, close to home has probably come up a good 5 times already. Let me know down in the comments below if it did. But seriously, when we're talking about a system that could develop just off the U.S. coastline, that is something of serious concern that we really have to keep a close eye on, because that is incredibly, incredibly near the proximity of some major populated areas and some major coastlines. So, it's not something that we're going to have to just kind of sit back and wait for develop, because by the time it develops, it's already posing a threat to the Carolinas and getting back into Florida and Georgia. So in order to really establish how this happens, right, how are we expecting to get some sort of tropical development this close to the United States? Well, watch what happens with our overall weather pattern in the lower 48. This is our 500 millibar jet, and this is the GEFS model. This is an ensemble of 18 to 19 different weather models that essentially average out to produce one run using all those members. So it kind of gives us an idea on how confident our models are in a particular synoptic weather pattern change. you notice that we have this area of high pressure, or this ridge axis, off the coast of the Gulf, particularly over central Mexico and extending as far north as Texas. This is more so an area and a broad area of high pressure, but then you notice this cutoff low, or this cutoff trough, that eventually digs down from the Canadian provinces and moves eastward. Watch what that does here, and we'll keep an eye on this next loop. Look at what happens here in the Atlantic. You get this high pressure to continue to build out in the central area of Mexico, and then it creates this shortwave trough. Because we have a progressive weather pattern in the United States, you get essentially a ridge, trough, ridge pattern. In this case, here's our trough axis, here is our area of high pressure, and then here is the trough that builds. So it's a trough, ridge, trough. Trough number one, here's your area of high pressure / ridge, and then here's your trough that builds just off the coast of Florida. If we were to denote this trough, and kind of follow me here as we go through this loop, if we were to draw out the trough and more defined as it is towards the end of the run, any low pressure is going to form along the trough axis or a little bit downstream of that. So this corridor that the GEFS likes to highlight here is where we expect to see some subtropical development. Look at that. It actually highlights those height falls, meaning that there's going to be some sort of low pressure that is likely to form just off the coast of Florida and then eventually move right into the Carolinas. Here's the thing. Bad news, good news. The bad news is, right now as it stands, the models are pretty confident in that solution, and it makes a lot of sense as to why. If we have this cutoff low / trough moving through over top of that Pacific high, then subsequently you're going to have some sort of trough divot that develops. So it makes a lot of sense as to why we're really confident in that. So the bad news is there's high confidence that we are going to likely see some sort of tropical development within this localized area. The good news, if there is any, is that this system doesn't have a lot of room to run. It's not going to have a lot of time or a lot of opportunity to develop into likely a major hurricane. Is there the chance that we could potentially see a tropical storm out of this? It's certainly not out of the question. But to see a hurricane, I think, is a little bit uncertain right now, and I would say it's rather unlikely. We'll have to, of course, continue to monitor that. It's ultimately going to depend on how fast the thing moves. And even if it was to slow down, guys, this isn't a very large area to run with, okay? We have had hurricanes in the past that form pretty close and then move north, but it's still pretty rare. So I would say, at least at the moment, the likely case scenario is that we are going to see some sort of tropical development here as we get into the weekend. Maybe a tropical storm status, tropical depression, but anything higher than that, we'll just have to continue to monitor that scenario going forward. One other map that I wanted to show you, guys, this is my favorite. As I've mentioned, the analogy that I like to throw out is that this literally looks like a 5-year-old taking a crayon and drawing over a map and not drawing within the lines. And I was taught as a kid, you got to draw on the lines. Well, this 5-year-old here clearly didn't, right? There is scribbles everywhere. But we use this spaghetti plot in order to diagnose what's happening here in the lower 48. It's not just something we use in the tropics. We also use it to determine our confidence interval for a particular weather pattern. As you notice, based on our spread, very high confidence that we have this area of high pressure really build out in central Mexico. And we also have our cutoff trough just to the north of that. And even still, very high confidence that you do get this trough axis to build. Again, this makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you didn't even have a weather model, it would only make sense to expect something to develop out in this area, because when you have a trough axis that builds, well, you're going to subsequently get some sort of low pressure within that trough axis based on the height falls, and so you will likely get some sort of development within that trough axis corridor. So we have very high confidence here on our GEFS spaghetti plot that also corresponds with the mean average from the GEFS, indicating that we will likely see a tropical system develop just off the coast of the Carolinas and Florida and Georgia, and then eventually move north. As I mentioned, it doesn't have much room to run. If it does form, it's going to form in this very small corridor, and it's got to go north, right? Because that trough is going to continue to move northeast, so it's going to pull it with it. and it's going to only be able to move north-northeast. It's not going to be able to necessarily go out into the waters. We don't have any frontal boundary here on this map, so it's not going to be displaced and sort of veer off to the right. This would just move directly north. So we certainly have to keep a very close eye on that. Again, very high confidence here from our GEFS model on essentially what we can see. If you weren't buying into the GEFS, you can also take a look here at the EPS, and that's giving us also a very strong signal at this high pressure in central Mexico building, and then you have that trough build right with it. There's your low pressure moving north, just like that. So the EPS is also showing very high confidence in that solution. By the way, if you're keeping track of sort of the timeline here, that wouldn't be until likely Friday, and then eventually getting into this weekend for additional development. The GEFS also, this is the tropical tidbits interpretation or the color table. This also just confirms what we just saw. And we went over a lot of this here in the top of our discussion just now. But it also is indicating this sort of Pacific jet ejecting into the four corner states, thereby building a high pressure in the central Pacific or central Mexico, and then eventually extending to where there's a trough axis that dips right into Florida. So that way we can get some low pressure development. So that all said, this concludes today's video. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, type them in the comments below. I'd be happy to answer those for you. Be sure to like and subscribe, share with family and friends. And with that being said, we will see you on the next weather video, which will be tomorrow. And it's going to be early because I'm going to be out of town in the afternoon. So I'll make sure to get this out first thing in the morning, and we will provide you an update on our tropical weather systems.